She serves on the board of her children's Jewish day school. In addition, Rabbi Gerson is on the board of African Mission Healthcare, which delivers healthcare to the African poor, and of United Hatzalah of Israel, which provides rapid and free medical response throughout Israel. Sorry. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me in the back? Are we good? Okay, great. I'm so delighted to have this honor, so thanks for calling me up. Solomon ibn Gabirol, who's an 11th century Jewish poet and philosopher, who actually wrote in Arabic and was widely read in Christian and Muslim audiences, has said in his book, Mibhar HaPninim, seek wisdom with the same eagerness with which you would search for hidden treasures, for it is more precious than gold and silver. He also, and this is back in the 11th century, so timely today, said, truth establishes all things, falsehood overthrows them. So let's hope we can find more truth and more wisdom. And there's no one better right now for us to hear from than Roland Fryer, who is, above all things, a seeker of truth. A little bit about his background. He had what we might call an extremely challenging childhood. He was raised in Louisville, Texas. His early years were marked by numerous hardships, including a mom who left when he was quite young, a dad who struggled with alcoholism and ended up eventually in jail, which more or less had Roland fending for himself. In spite of that, he managed to get an academic scholarship, an athletic scholarship at the University of Texas at Arlington, but immediately was drawn in when he took his first economics course. And we can only say that it was a meteoric rise from there. He graduated in 2.5 years with honors, earned a PhD from Penn State, continued with postdoc work at the University of Chicago with Nobel laureate Gary Becker, and joined the faculty at Harvard, where he rose rapidly through the ranks, so that by age 30 he had achieved tenure. He was the second youngest ever to do that. He also received the John Bates Clark Medal, which is a prize for the best economist under 40 in the world, and is largely understood to be pretty much as significant as the Nobel. And he was won the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Award, in 2011. So you might be wondering, what exactly does he study for which he's received all these accolades? Well, what makes him perfect for this crowd is that he upends many commonly held assumptions. In his case, they're about race, discrimination, education, and police violence. One area of his research is academic achievement gaps. He identifies problems with empirical data, of course, and even better than that, proposes solutions. So just as one example that I found really heartening, at the Harlem Children's Zone, which those of you who are from Manhattan I'm sure are familiar with, where they take 4 Black kids and through a simple, and I saw a really comical video of you explaining this, but I'll leave the jokes to you. He said his grandma wasn't all that impressed with what he figured out, which was that they needed a simple recipe including hard work, extra time spent on their education, high expectations, and diligent weeding out of low-performing teachers. And lo and behold, these perfectly capable human beings closed the achievement gap in 3 years. In terms of policing outcomes, he had a very controversial study that was received with controversy, in which he found in 2016 that although African Americans and Hispanics were more likely to experience police use of force than whites, they were not more likely to be shot by police than whites. You can imagine the controversy that stirred. Roland Fryer has been unrelenting in his willingness to ask provocative questions and follow the data wherever it may lead, even when his findings challenge popular liberal dogma. And unfortunately, like so many others that we know, he has paid the price for his commitment to seeking and sharing truth. So it's important for us to understand that courage is to be rewarded. In 2018, there was a Title IX complaint at Harvard, and by all accounts, there was an absolutely disproportionate response to the findings, which enabled liberal peers and administrators to use all means available to derail him as a scholar. Unable to fire him because of tenure, they tied his hands as best they could. Today, we welcome Roland Fryer with great enthusiasm. He's one of the most gifted economists of his generation, It's an honor. We honor him for his relentless pursuit of truth and his commitment to improving our society through empirical research. Please give him a warm welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. This is the first time I've been out of the house in 4 years. So I'm really excited about it. And look, I hope this is a conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit and show you some data, but then I hope we can open it up and have a dialogue. I honestly, I don't seek out controversy. I mean, my grandmother, when she was alive, my grandmother helped raise me, and she's the most fundamental person in my life. And she used to tell me, I used to say, Grandma, I don't go into this looking for controversy. I'm just telling the truth. I'll tell you what I tell my grandmother. We're almost friends. I'll say, look, I'm just saying real shit, Grandma. And like, real shit hurts sometimes. And she said, David, if every time you go to the club, a fight break out, maybe it's you. So maybe. But it's all, it really, you know, it was alluded to in my background or whatever, where I grew up. I saw some crazy stuff as a kid. There's no doubt about that. My spat with Harvard, people say to me, oh, it's so hard. No, growing up in a crack house is hard. That shit was annoying. And they're different. We have to always remember they're different. I just care about people who are disadvantaged. I just have seen so much talent in my neighborhood wasted. Truly. You know, when I first got to Harvard, some person said, oh, you know, you should meet this person. They're really brilliant. And I used to joke around, and I would say, yeah, there was a kid like with that level of intelligence in my neighborhood. I think he's homeless now. And there really was a difference in terms of opportunities, et cetera. And so I'm just out for that. And that is what stirs me. That's what gets me up at 4 or 5 o'clock every morning is opportunity. It is, you know, if there is bias, it is a market failure, and I want to get rid of it. And so, like, and it's not just about uncomfortable truths. It's actually focusing on the things that matter. There is not a person in my neighborhood where I grew up who cares at all about capitalizing the letter B in black. Zero. We can applaud ourselves as progress if we want. That's just not it. And they don't care what you call them. You know what they care? They want you to call them employed. But we'll get to that in a second. So yeah, my whole career has been, like before Harvard, I was at McDonald's, and I was pretty good at that. I think they appreciate it more than Harvard. They made me employed of the month. I think Harvard's going to make me employee of the month. So I'm going to talk about 2 examples of the pursuit that I've been on in the last couple of decades. But I just want to say before I get started, I'm super grateful to be here. Thank you, David, and for all the what this conference is all about is everything that we need. It really, like, if you can't, I taught my undergraduate class in the fall, had 200 students in it, and I would do office hours before class. And so I'd sit there at 8:30 in the morning, and there'd be 40 kids in office hours, and so we'd chat before class. And I said to them, how do you all tell me about the debates you're having about race and gender in your dorm rooms? Like, oh, you're old, professor. We don't debate about those things anymore. I said, what are you talking about? When I was an undergraduate, we'd stay up all night, and there was huge heterogeneity, not just, black people thought this, white people thought, within all sorts of heterogeneity. So we would say, people say, oh, I don't know, maybe people should work harder. I don't know, maybe government support should be more targeted. There were all these debates. They don't happen anymore, right? Because people are worried that if you say the wrong thing, that you'll be labeled with this label or that label. And so I pleaded with my students. I said, look, you're supposed to be the best and brightest in the world, and if you're not discussing issues of race and gender, how the hell are we going to make progress? And in fact, what are we going to do for those who are stuck in these neighborhoods and don't have escape velocity? And they literally went, got that before, right? So the fact that you're here, the fact that you're having these conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they may be, the fact that you are seeking truth in a world of tribes is, for me, everything, right? And that's the reason I'm so happy to be here. All right, so let's talk about education. So I've been interested in education for a very long time. So let me just back up. A few years ago, I did the incredible, when I started talking about research, I had my grandma in the back of my head who was never impressed with anything I ever did, right? Just never, we'll get to that, just never. Anyway, I got started, and the first thing I thought was, wow, I'm an economist, I'm gonna pay kids for everything, right? And, you know, my grandmother had an incentive program. It's not the ones you can use in schools. Hers is more of a negative. Program. I mean, my grandmother and I got along very well, but she pulled 2 guns on me. The woman does not. Really, like, you know, I used to bring the street language because my grandmother, I didn't mean to go into this, but I can't help it. But we had this like trivariate in my neighborhood. I grew up in a kind of a blue collar, all black neighborhood, right? There were only time we saw white people when they were coming to get black people. And so we would just hang out and whatever. And so it was an interesting culture. As I was telling Ian before, I didn't realize that like we were in poverty. It was like I got to Harvard and someone was like, you know, you grew up in poverty. I was like, for real? That sounds fucked up. Anyway, so like we would always just kind of hang out, and I had this very interesting heterogeneity. We were talking about it before a few minutes ago. My great aunt, I guess she would be my grandmother's mother's sister, was a school principal. Her husband was a school principal. They've been that for 25 years. Deep educators. My grandmother was a teacher for 35 years. My grandmother's sister ran the largest crack gang in Central Florida. That's how I learned to count, because my cousin Doobie, he couldn't count his money. And so he would come over. I could be here all day with this. I love it. So he would come over with a paper bag, and he'd be like, yo, little man, how much in it? It sounds cool, right? But the problem is I only learned to count by 20s. You know what I'm saying?
I forgot to mention you had some comedy clubs
Yeah.
in your room.
See, you don't tell them that.
I didn't tell them.
Wow, it's very
You really did.
In any event, so we grew up in the neighborhood, and it was this dichotomy was interesting, and we used to debate about everything, and that's the kind of neighborhood I grew up in. And when I just thought incentives for everything, right? And so first thing out of the gate, I thought at Harvard, I'm going to pay kids to learn, because my kids, as I said, my grandmother had a negative incentive program. And we did that, and we learned a lot. I won't go into that, I don't have time, but it really showed that if incentives were really focused, that you could really change the achievement of inner city kids by just changing the incentives. And the more you align the incentives, the more powerful they were. So the ones where we just provided incentives for kids worked okay. When we provided incentives for kids and their parents, right, worked even better. I remember and people hated this idea. Hated it. They were picketing me outside my house. Right? I moved here to New York. I lived in 22nd, so I could get down to 20 really quickly. And I remember walking outside the little apartment that I was in, and someone was holding up a picket sign that said, Roland Fryer is the worst thing for black people since the Tuskegee experiment. And I was using it stuff effective, right? I'm like, whatever, right? Like, I could care less. What do you think, right? My grandmother would say, you can't whip my ass. What you gonna do about it? Right? Like, there's nothing to do. But then I stopped, and I was like, whoa, yo, man, all I'm trying to do is provide motivation for kids. We're talking about unknowingly injecting people with syphilis. I said, I agree, it's a toss-up, and I walked off. These incentives could be very powerful. And people really were upset about it. I remember I was on a panel in DC, and usually, you know, the typical panel etiquette is that you disagree with your panel member, at least back in the days when we could disagree, and you would do it all through these veiled, tacit kind of ways. This woman got up and faced me on the panel and was like, what's next? Paying people not to beat each other up? And I said, that's a good one. I like that. So we did that one too, and I'm giving her no credit. Anyway, so we did these experiments. We gave away about $15 million across 300 schools or so, and I don't know, 40, 50,000 kids. And we learned a lot. And if you're cash strapped, incentives can be an amazing way to get kids motivated to do things. And look, my kids have incentives, right? Like, I grew up hating rich kids, and now I have 2 of them. And they get incentives all the time, right? And the incentives are what? Like, my kids, oh my God, it was so sickening. You know, when they're 3 and 4, everything they do is like a big deal. Oh yeah, you said hello, oh wonderful, right? And I said to my wife, I said, are they gonna need a flat machine? in kindergarten, because there's just a lot of enforcement going on here. They get incentives that way. I mean, my kids, everything they do, every math thing, oh, you're a math genius. And I love it. We do it, right? But just very different. And so I see that, and I see how my colleagues do it. And so incentives are everywhere. The idea that we shouldn't give them to poor kids because of whatever, I think is silly. And in fact, it's not about what we think. The data are very clear that this is a high return on investment item. But I have to say, after I did that work, it just wasn't enough, right? So if the achievement gap is 1, incentives can get you 0.2 of that. So what are you going to do with the other 0.8? And what I found being here in New York, and I ended up meeting these artisanal geniuses like Jeff Canada and Eva Moskowitz and others who were just transforming the lives of kids who look and grew up a lot like me. And I was blown away by that. And I remember sitting with my wife over pizza. She wasn't my wife just yet. And I said to her, I said, look, I've got a choice. I can either keep doing these papers that economists love, right? I mean, paying kids incentives to do, I mean, that struck gold among my colleagues. They're like, oh, that's terrific, right? I mean, academics like nothing more than to confirm their own beliefs. I mean, it was, that was straight up fair. Or I could just try to figure out what people like Jeff Canada are doing to transform these lives and see if we can boil it down into something that's more efficient, more transportable. Maybe we can put him into pill form and distribute it. And I said, but there's no prizes coming that way, because that's like, I don't know what that is. Is that engineering? I don't know what that is, right? It's not economics. And she looked at me and she says, you know what you have to do. And so this research project that I'm going to describe to you is the first project in that vein. And again, we did all this work on mobility. We know education is the #1 correlate with mobility. Now, in another time, when you bring me back, I'll tell you 2 through 7 are all psychological. We have to have a conversation about that. I'm sure you and I should have a conversation about that. Okay, so but #1 is education. And so you got all these people like Ian Rowe, like Jeff Canada, all doing these wonderful things. And so on the other hand, if I look at the broad surveys, that is on this side, if I look at the broad surveys, if I look at all charter schools, the average charter school is not that much better than the average public school. But there's a distribution. There are ones on the right, like I described, and we all seen the after-school specials that are unbelievable, right? And in New York, you have an embarrassment of riches. You have more of the people of the institutions on the right tail of that distribution. So in New York, on average, charter schools are actually 0.09 standard deviations better, a month better than regular public schools. But on the left side of that distribution, there are charter schools that suck and should be shut down. Okay? Now, as a nerd, as a data nerd, like my man sitting at my table over here, we look at that distribution and we see nothing but opportunity. Because wow, think about the experiment that has happened here. You have people who are making choices, those choices have consequences. Now, what can we do to understand what choices are leading to which outcomes? And that's what we did. We came here to New York and we really annoyed 100 charter school leaders. We went and collected thousands of pages on their HR practices, on how they hire teachers, on how they incentivize teachers. We put 360-degree cameras down the hallways when classes passed. We taped every classroom we could get our hands on. We brought the videos back. We stopped them every 2 minutes and coded up what was in them. Okay? This was big data before we called it big data. And more importantly, it was wide data. It looked more like a bioinformatics problem where you've got gene sequences on the right-hand side and a disease on the left, and you've got to figure out what things are correlated with it. Okay, and so we used all those techniques. And basically what we found was that there were 5 things that explained 50% of the variance and what made some charter schools good and other charters not so good. Okay? The first one was more time in school. So it's the basic physics of education. If you're behind, those in front of you need to either go faster or those in front of you need to slow down. Okay, and so I just have a sense, being old now, but a former athlete, that like no one in athletic thinks that the other team should slow down. So you got to speed up. All right, so more time in school. The second was how you actually use groups to engage kids in what I call high dosage tutoring. So tutoring is an after school program as an afterthought. Save yourself the time. But what we noticed was that when kids were in groups of 6 or less for 4 or more days per year, for a week, real gains happened, right? And so
how you use small grouping of kids as homogeneous as possible, not to get too far into the details, was really effective. The third was human capital management. What did you do? How did you use data to drive teachers? How did you give them feedback? And that's related to the fourth, which is data-driven instruction, right? Like Ian knows this better than everybody. I feel guilty saying this in front of him, but like data used to be an asset in schools in the beginning. I think now it's more like a liability, right? Like you go in and they're huge data rooms, everyone's got them. And they look like big stoplights, right? Like there's some kids who are green, there's a whole lot of kids who are yellow, there's even more that are red, right? And then you say to people, wow, this is an interesting data room, kind of. What do you do when a kid is yellow? Oh, well, that's for next year. So for this year, it was just identifying that they're yellow, right? That school's not going anywhere. Now, the schools that were highly effective were like, oh, if you hit yellow, here's what we do. If 80% of the kids hit yellow, then we slow down, we reteach the whole lesson. If 20% of the kids are yellow, then the ones that are green advance. The 20, we wrap them into our small group tutoring and we catch them up because there's this logical tension between pace and mastery. And so we got to get it all done, right? That makes sense to me. And that's what you see in the schools that are changing the lives of core students. And the last one is really, really important to me. And it is culture and expectations. All of these schools that were in our sample had kids who were in poverty. Every one of them had, on average, 85, 88% female-headed households. The differentiation was what they thought they could expect of the students who came across their doors, right? And to way oversimplify, it ranged somewhere between, isn't it just amazing they can get here? To, I have 7 hours to make up for all those facts. And in those 7 hours, I have to be so much more efficient because you're right. They are lower income and their family structures are different. And so we've got 7 hours and that's our 7 hours. And in fact, I'm going to figure out a way. Why do we need 7 hours? I want 9 hours. I want to figure out how I can bring them back here on the weekends. And okay? Culture and expectations. And I can just tell you, it's one of these things that really gets me fired up because, you know, in 10th grade, I walked into school and I wanted to drop out of high school. I thought high school was kind of dumb. And my father was in the newspaper because of some stuff he'd gotten into and he was going to go to prison. And my counselor came up to me and I didn't feel any way about it. Let me just be very clear. This is going to sound really weird to some of you, others of you will get it. People going in and out of jail in my community wasn't a big deal. Okay, probably should have been. But it wasn't like anyone was going, woe is me. It was kind of like a revolving door. Oh, it's your turn. Your dad's locked up. No. It just wasn't, right? It just wasn't a thing. And so I didn't think a lot about it. I just thought school was kind of dumb and it seemed like a good excuse to stop going. And so I walked in and my counselor said, oh man, I read the newspaper. It's just so bad. I'm so sorry. And I said, I'm good. I just need to get to football practice. I'm going to light somebody up. All will be fine. He says, oh, thank you for putting on a brave face. He said, but I checked into it today. And there's this new program. You can come to school at 8:30, get out at 10:30, and get full credit. And I said, you know what? It is bad. Tell me about that program. 2 hours. That is amazing. Right? And look, I know he was trying to do the right thing. I'm not, you know, I've had conversations about this. I went back home. Yeah, I get it all. But I didn't ask for that. Right? And I teased him. I was like, you're the reason I don't know anything about U.S. history, right? Because that wasn't in my 2 hours. I know a lot about fades because he put me in cosmetology. But class 7, they told us to prep someone's feet, and I was like, I'm out. So you get the idea. Like, I literally didn't ask for that, right? Like, and I get that he was trying to do the right thing. I guess all I'm saying is a very cliche thing. The kids will rise up or down to our expectations. Did I want somebody to be there for me? Do I want an adult that I could count on? You can bet I did need that. I'm not gonna lie to you, I did need that, right? I was 15 years old. I was dumb enough to go apply for an apartment because I was like, I got to live on my own. I'm 15, right? And they're like, sir, you can't have an apartment at 15. I forged my birth certificate so I could work at McDonald's. I was born June 4th, 1977. I couldn't forge my birth certificate without that handwriting at the bottom, and so I had to wait until 1974 so I could take the 4 from June 4th and put it over. And I did that, and I was working at McDonald's at 13. And you know, they had me on shift manager. I was really gonna make it work there. Anyway, all of that, but I just, to borrow a phrase that Ian told me this morning over email, I just needed some agency. I didn't need anything. Truly, I just didn't. Okay, and not to say other people don't. You got it. But anyway, I get fired up about the culture and high expectations because it's so incredibly important. Because I do believe that this kind of woe is me, there's nothing you can do, you know, you'd be just happy to do whatever, is not the way to go. And it certainly wasn't for me. Anyway, so these 5 things. We weren't, and we did this, we wrote it up, but we weren't content with that. We wanted to put these in a real experiment. Everything I do is real experiments. I wanted to put these in a real experiment in regular old public school. Because part of the thing I wanted to understand was whether or not this work that Ian and Jeff Cannon and others are doing is actually transferable to regular old public school kids, because whether they like it or not, there is some selection in the charter school, right? So when people say, "Oh, we take whoever, it's random," I'll say, "Okay, but if you haven't filled out a 12-page form, there is something there, and you're getting a differentiation." And so, in econ language, I wanted to understand the external validity of these geniuses, right? And so we looked all over the world. Oh my gosh, we went to Omaha, like whoever goes to Omaha. We went to Omaha, and we were like, "Oh, we got big grant. We're going to take over northern Omaha." And implement these things there. And when they found out that these insights came from charter schools, they shut the whole thing down. We had the funding, we had the schools, the kids were excited, the principals, they shut it down. Could you imagine? Let me just step back for a second. Could you imagine, like, which COVID vaccine you got? You got the charter one? No, I don't take that one. It'd be unheard of, right? We went to Haiti after the earthquake. We were like, well, here's a place who clearly needs our schools, right? They didn't want us. Nobody wanted us, except for we got really lucky in that we had a superintendent who was on their last kind of hurrah in Houston. I mean, he had transferred to other districts before. This was his last stop. And so he wasn't worried about what someone was going to say about him next in Houston. And they had 9 schools that were about to be taken over by the state. And we were the last option because they had gone to the KIPs of the world and others and said, "Hey, could you take over these 9 schools?" And they said, "Well, yeah, sure. Here's what we'll do. We'll shut them down and we will open them up one grade level at a time because that's our model." And they said, "Well, these schools have real traditions. Kashmir High School has an amazing jazz program from the 1970s, and the neighborhood doesn't want to get rid of the schools. They want them reformed. We don't want new schools. We want a gut rehab of the old ones." Okay? Long story short, we did that. And so, but I needed a sample because I'm a nerd. So I said, "Look, the 9 schools are fine, but I need 20. And it's one of these situations where like, "You want 20 of the worst? Here you go." I didn't know what I was getting into, man. That was like hard work. And so for those 20 schools, we did these 5 things. We tried to do them with fidelity. So, for example, we lengthened the school year 2 weeks. We lengthened the school day 1 hour. That was in our secondary schools. So for secondary schools, we had 4 high schools, 5 middle schools, and then we had 11 elementary schools. When we lengthened the school year and the school day for the secondary schools, I got a call from someone, a lobbyist in the travel tourism industry, like, "What are you doing? Kids need to come to Padre Island." And I said, "Dude, I'm just trying to help poor kids." He said, "You said poor? I'm fully behind this." See that, right? Like, it was fine. So we managed to get the politics right, but it was months and months and months of retail politics in people's living rooms explaining the vision of taking these charter principles with it. In terms of small group tutoring, we hired roughly 500 tutors to come down to Houston. They made $25,000 a year, and they tutored kids in groups of 3 or less. And so we tutored all 6th graders, all 9th graders, and all 4th graders. We should have tutored kids in every grade, but in terms of budget constraints, we only did 1 grade that we thought was high leverage. Okay, And people thought we were crazy. It says no one's going to ever, go to Houston to tutor. Why would anybody do that? We had like 2,000 applications in 6 weeks, right? People want, I'm always optimistic. People want to do what's right when they think that there's something that's going to really potentially fundamentally change lives for those who are disadvantaged. In terms of human capital management, half the teachers were removed from the schools, 19 out of 20 of the principals. Now you might say, well, Roland, are you crazy? How'd you do that? Michelle Reed was on the cover of Time magazine sweeping people away with many less teachers than that. And the answer is, with private dollars, you just buy out contracts, fixed costs, right? And so maybe not everyone can do that, but in Houston, that's what we were able to do. And so we tried to infuse these schools with, and we interviewed every single teacher, okay, every single one. I sat in hundreds of these, and there is not a teacher who said, you know what, I know that these kids can learn. And I'm not giving you some phrase, all kids can learn. I'm telling you, I know they can. And if you could just give me a little bit more professional development, I can crush it. All those teachers are still in the building. But I can tell you, there were also teachers who said, look, you got 5 things? I said, yeah, we got 5 things. They're running down. All I need is 1 thing. I said, what? You got a silver bullet? Yeah, smarter kids. Those teachers are no longer in the building. Right. Okay, so that's what we did there. On data-driven instruction, we did what all effective charters do, or many effective charters do. We assessed every day, basically, but every few weeks, and we understood from those assessments how we needed to group kids, how we needed to move kids, which ones, who were struggling with what, and really just attack the problem. It's pretty much that simple. It's not elegant. This is just normal blocking and tackling. And then the last one, I don't know how to convince you that we changed the culture and expectations, but when we took over Addicts Middle School, I walked every school before we were managing it, and they had an 8th grade celebration. The 8th grade celebration was about, great, we're going to a high school, awesome, isn't that cool? In the 8th grade celebration, the kids took the piano and threw it off the stage. And the principal looked at me and says, "Do you sure you know what you're getting into?" And I said, "Ma'am, this is Texas." I said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, if you're afraid of a 12-year-old, that's the real problem." Right? Like, I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying there's not a 12-year-old in the world I'm scared of. I'm just not. Right? And so, yeah, okay, we took them over. Addicts High School there were 150 kids at Addicts Middle School. They used to sit in the cafeteria. And you go up to the kids and say, "What are you doing in here?" "Chilling." "Why are you chilling?" "There's nothing in the classrooms." And they were right. When we took over the school again, I can't tell you that we changed culture, but I can tell you they were no longer in the cafeteria. Right? They were in the classes, and I remember going around the classes the first few weeks of school telling the teachers, look, they're in the classes, now we got to deliver. Right? And so we did our best to implement these 5 things with real fidelity. And you would think this would be like the simplest thing in the world to do, right? More time, small group instruction, better teachers, ones that want to be there, and leaders, which is our real secret part of our formula. If you get a good leader, we got 5 tenants, they do the other 95. Data-driven instruction and a culture of high expectations. Okay. Here are the results. This is smaller than I wanted, but that's okay. All right, so these are really effective charter schools here. This is our children's zone elementary schools, this is our children's zone middle schools. Huge effects in math, smaller effects in reading. These are KIPP schools, right? Big effects in math, smaller effects in reading. These are the national. All right. So if the secondary schools where we implement all 5 tenets, those are the effects you get. You can see the difference. These are the effects you get in our Houston experiment when you implement all 5 tenets, meaning you have all 5 of them, even the 2. Okay? We did the same thing in Denver, same thing in Chicago, other places. And all I want you to see from this is the things that these charter school geniuses are doing are fully transferable. Fully. They're hard, right? And so we talk about uncomfortable truths. The uncomfortable truth when it comes to education in America is it's actually straightforward. Just no one has the courage to do it. So while we're fiddling around with capitalizing the letter B, there are thousands of kids whose futures we're screwing up because we want to both reform schools and win a popularity contest. Well, you ain't going to do that. Not in that year. That's what I tell the superintendent. I was a superintendent of Houston. I don't know, he probably doesn't want me to tell the story. I don't care. I'm flying into Houston. You know, I used to do it all the time. And he says, I'm picking up from the airport. I said, Terry, you'll be picking up there. I'm picking up from the airport. I said, Terry, it's a long ways. I'm picking you up. He picks me up in a new Porsche. I said, what the hell is this? You stole a car? He says, no, man. I want a superintendent of the year. There's a big cash prize. And I said, I told you that you can't win the popularity contest that year. But when people see this stuff as effective, that's what really matters. 20,000 kids in these experiments. I won't bore you with the details, but close the achievement gap in the elementary schools in 3 years and the secondary schools in 5 years. Now, I know we're not supposed to talk about achievement gaps, they're opportunity gaps. You know how dumb that is? Can we say dumb still? I don't know, but like that's so silly, right? Like worried about how we frame the question of why people can't achieve is crazy. What we need to do is roll up our sleeves, get in there, hire tutors, lengthen the school year, and do what we know works. This is from a randomized trial. If you have another randomized trial that shows better results, I'm all ears. In the meantime, we know what to do. The return on investment here is what, 30, 40%, something like that. That's education. Uncomfortable truth is we actually know what to do. I know Ian back there rolling his eyes. I know you know what to do, right? No, my grandmother used to do the same thing. Ian looks at me and kind of, I mean, he's not, obviously he's much younger than my grandmother. My grandmother used to do the same stuff. I would come to her, I did this with this paper. I was like, Grandma, I didn't really discover something. She said, baby, what you got? She said to me, I've been a teacher for 35 years. Tell me what you got. I said, well, I don't want to go into economics. She said, try me. What are you doing? Why are you traveling so much? I said, well, Grandma, here's what we got to do. We got to, and I gave her my 5 things. And again, I've said this before. I'll say it again. My grandmother, she doesn't suffer any fools. She's an old Southern black woman. She said, baby, they pay you for that shit. Not much, Grandma. All right. Okay, let's talk about, and I haven't offended you on education, let's talk about police. Look, I saw the same, how am I doing on time? Okay, not cool? I don't know what that means. Okay, I'm keeping. All right, okay. I haven't offended you yet. Let's talk about police. Okay. Look, I saw the same cell phone footage that you have. I'm probably more biased against the police than you are, because again, the only time they came to my neighborhood was to take someone away, right? They never came to, all these after school specials where they play basketball with you. They ain't do that with us. Okay. So I really wanted to go after it. And I remember when Ferguson happened, I watched it, but it was the Walter Scott in South Carolina that got me furious. The running, I don't know what it was. It was just the way he was running. I wasn't there. I don't know the details, but that got me fired up. And it's like I gotta do something. But I'm not really made to protest. That's not my thing. God bless everybody else, but I get hot, right? And I just don't want to be outside that long. So I'll do everything before kids that will go outside. I'm not gonna protest it, but I'm a data nerd. And so what can I do? Is what I thought to myself to do this. And so I had all sorts of bad ideas, right? And I won't go through those. But one of my colleagues stopped me as I was rattling off my list of bad ideas. And he says, Roland, the cool thing that I really thought about your school stuff is that you got in there. You actually did stuff in the schools. You weren't just downloading data and running regressions. He says, but do you know a lot about the police? And I was like, ooh, that hurt. I don't know a lot about the police. And so I said, I'm going to solve this. The next day, there's some gratuitous connections, I was going to embed myself in police department. So I did it in Camden, New Jersey was my first one. I highly recommend everyone ride along with police. I do not recommend do it in Camden, New Jersey. Wow. Anyway, it was the best education I'd gotten since my PhD. I had on so many dimensions, right? Like, first I did it in Camden, and then I did it with other police departments, and I finished in Houston. And the difference between Houston and Camden and the way the police interacted with the community, it's not data, but it was informative for me. And more importantly, these types of interactions allowed me to collect data that no one's collected before. That was the most important, right? Because sitting around and arguing about police and defunding police. My grandmother's not alive. Oh my gosh, she'd go through the roof with that idea. She'd be like, I got stuff I want to protect. I need me some police. I mean, it just wouldn't work, right? And so I was really interested in this. And I have to, again, as I said, incredible experience. So I'll just give you some quick highlights. I'm not proud to say this, but if you ride around in a police car for 11 hours looking for bad people, about hour 4, you start to find some bad people, right? Like I was the worst police officer ever. They were like, you need to go to training or something. Because I was in there, I was literally like, hey, what's in the basketball? They were like, he's just dribbling the basketball. I was like, that's what you think, let's arrest him, right? It was crazy. They put me through police training. And I did one of these, like hypotheticals of the police. It was incredible. So you wear the full weight belt, and you got a gun. You don't have the real pistol, but you have the Glock. But it's outfitted with like CO2 or something, so it gives the kickback. But luckily, there's no bullets in it. And you got the full screen. It's a full experience that you go in and you do this stuff. Okay. One tiny example. I show up at a pool party in my simulation, and at the pool party, there's a white guy there, long hair. I'm suspicious already, all right? And he's wearing a flannel shirt at a pool party. And so I say, because it's a simulation, they are escalating and de-escalating. Someone's behind the screen you don't see, but you're talking out loud. You got the weight belt, you got everything. So I say to him, yo, what's up with the shirt, right? I didn't say that. I wasn't that bad, but that's what I wanted to say. Okay, so I said, I'm here. And he says, what are you doing? Always harassing me. And I said, sir, let's calm it down. De-escalation. I'm here to protect and serve. I don't want any trouble. He says, well, you're always harassing me. And I said, all right, not me. And he put his hands in his pockets. And then I made the connection. Hands in pockets, flannel shirt, long hair, pool party. So I pulled my gun on him, right? And I was like, freeze! And they turned the lights on. They're like, sir, that is the worst policing we've ever seen in our lives, right? I was like, all right. That's what you do in my neighborhood. Anyway, so we had a real back and forth. And I was like, well, why do you do that in some neighborhoods and not the others? And we had real conversations about that. Riding around, as I said, I am embarrassed at my feeling that, like, if you're looking for bad people, you find bad people. On the other hand, I went into other cities where we actually walked a beat. And I would see like people in those situations that I thought should clearly be arrested. And they said to me, no, that is just Mr. Jones. He does that all the time at 3 o'clock. Ignore him. What I'm saying here is that there's an information problem in policing that is really, really difficult. Who are the bad people, who are not? More interactions with people actually allows you to solve that information problem. And those are some of the things that I learned on the beat. Never would have learned that in the academy. The last call, so I was doing calls for service. So we were in a police car and we would hear, there's a robbery at Wendy's. So we rushed to Wendy's, right? Of course, we think we're rushing to Wendy's. We get there and the people are like, he was here with a gun 3 hours ago. Where were you there, right? And so we're like, oh my gosh, like now I know how that feels too, because I remember calling police and wondering why you take us so long. And anyway, so at the end of the first day in Camden, we get called into a row house, potential overdose. And the police bust down the door. We run into the row house, and someone died, 6 feet from me. And I look at the police officers and I say, I think I'm done for the day. I'll see you guys tomorrow. And why don't you guys take some time off too? I mean, something just happened. And when I'm in the field, I never question, criticize. I think about those things later. Maybe I'll send an email, light touch. I think I never judge. I have seen so many different spectrums of America. Who the hell am I? Right? So I don't do it. this I got close. I asked the police chief over dinner, I said, we saw someone die within 6 feet of us. And then the guys went and took the next call. I couldn't have dinner with you, but don't you think they could have 20 minutes off if something like that happens? He was incredulous. Oh, if I gave everybody 20 minutes off every time they saw somebody die in the streets, I was like, what? It was crazy to me what these guys endure and women endure. I literally was done and they were right back at the next call. Shots fired, here we go. Like, and the whatever it takes, I'm not going to put any adjectives on it, whatever it takes to hear shots fired and drive towards them, I don't have. I was like, don't you want to go that way? The shots, everything about me is like, yo, man, I grew up in these neighborhoods. When shots are over there, you go over here. Like, that's how I'm still alive. And unbelievable. Okay. And so what we wanted to do was try to understand really what were racial differences, what was the evidence for discrimination in all sorts of levels of force. Okay, so there's non-lethal use of force where you get pushed up against a car or handcuffed without arrested, etc. And then there's obviously the lethal use of force. And a couple of data challenges. Number one, lower level uses of force, really hard to find data on that, because if it's in the spirit of an arrest and you throw somebody in a car, that's just doing business. The question is, if someone pulls you over and slaps you around a little bit and lets you go, where the heck does that data reside? Turns out 10 million data points reside right here in New York City. Second piece is on lethal uses of force, right? Like you've got journalists out there, God bless them, but they're doing things like, well, if you look at the fraction of black people unarmed on a Sunday with the sun out relative to white people unarmed when it's cloudy, then you get real bias, right? I don't know what that is. Literally, that's not a statistical test. I don't know what that is. And so what we typically do in these things is to say, in the exact situation, using lots of data to try to characterize that situation, once you characterize the situation as fully as you can with the data, does race still have an independent effect? And that's the question we're trying to answer. But to do that, you need a lot more data than just things you can download. Okay, and lucky for us, that data came from a bunch of cities, but the one where it's the most detailed is from Houston. And it took real work to get that data, right? Like we literally sat in Houston while a sergeant watched us type it in. Okay? They wouldn't allow a thumb drive. They wouldn't allow anything because they were worried we were going to put, whatever, a virus on their computer and take everything out. I wish I was that sophisticated, but no, we were just literally there typing in the data. Okay. Let me show you the results. All right, these are odds ratios by use of force. So basically what this shows is what the racial difference is. The light blue is just raw data. So because people have accused me for lying with the data. So I just want to show you the raw and then it actually includes other controls. Okay, so this is the lowest level use of force. This is whether or not police put their hands on you during a stop. So it's a traffic stop. And police get down in the car and whether or not they put their hands on you at all. That's the least lowest level of use of force in the thing. And what you see is that black people are 53% more likely for the police to report they put their hands on. Okay? Now, if you were, I could show you other data, we could be here all afternoon, but if I show the other side where you just ask citizens what happens, that 53% becomes like 300%. Okay? Now, and people said, oh my God, Roland, so stupid. You use data that the police gave you. Slow down. If you use data that the police gave you and you still get a 53% difference, okay, maybe it's larger. I don't know, but 53% is huge, right? So that's enough to have action. Okay. No matter what you account for, that number never gets really that far below 20%. Right? The most disturbing number for me when it comes to lower level use of the force is that when you ask the police whether this person was fully compliant, okay? So a traffic stop happens. The person does everything you've asked them to do according to the police. I get that there's bias there, but it's pointing in the right direction. And the person is not arrested, And there's no contraband found in a nothing event, according to the police. Black people are still 25% more likely to have use of force in those interactions. Yeah, the dark blue is when we account for all the factors that we can. So controlling for all the variables that we have in the data. So that's why this one goes down, because once we account for a lot of things, then it gets smaller. Okay. So what's nice about the New York City data is because it's millions of data points, I literally can ask the question, if you're on this block during this time period, right, with these particular actions as reported by the police, what is the likelihood then? Okay, and no matter how much I stretch the data, it still gets around 20%. All right. That to me, I think there's something really to think about here, right? And part of it, I'm gonna skip to the end, is that when I talk to police, when we ride around in cars, you do 16 hours in a police car in Houston with a dude drinking Red Bull and Chex Mix for 16 hours, you get to know each other, right? And we chat about this kind of stuff. And he says, look, discharging your weapon is a life-changing event. He also says, roughing up a black kid is kind of not a life-changing, right? And so the incentives are quite different between those two actions. Fast forward, if I were to show you that what the results are on shootings, these might surprise you, right? So these are all going down because if anything, they're not statistically significant, but if anything, it's slightly less once you control for factors that black people will actually be shot by the police relative to whites. So on the lower level uses of force, we find really important racial differences. I think those are really important because it's not only that Black lives matter, but Black dignity matters as well. And if you've ever been pulled over and treated by the police in this way, it's a real thing, right? Like people email me after my results and says, okay, I'll grant you the lower level use of stuff, but this is supposed to be about lives, and like, they're fine. I said, if you think they're fine, give me your address, and I'll come over and throw you up against the car and see how you feel for the rest of the day. I think this is a real thing. And the reason I like to highlight it is because it happens thousands and thousands of times per day, whereas shootings, thank God, are less frequent. On the shootings, though, we find no evidence of racial differences. And that, I was warned I should never publish. And of course, I said, I'm going to do it even faster now. That is a result that has upset some. And, when Obama was in the White House, to his credit, after we put this paper out within 5 days, I went to the White House and I talked to him about it for 5 hours. And it was very serious, and I was interested as an academic in changing the world. But the part that made me chuckle was he says, I don't know, Roland, it could be that Houston is just an enlightened city. And I said, Mr. President, would you have said that before you saw the results? And he said, that's fair. So lots of work to do here. Only a few cities on the shootings, but that's the kind of analysis that we need to be doing. Last thing I'm going to share with you, because I want to get to the uncomfortable truest part of this, is what do we do about it? Okay. Lots of things that are untested. Maybe police reform is where education reform was in 2000. We're not collecting data. Maybe we should have data sets across every city that shows us what the use of force is, the disparity, so we can actually shine some light on the problem. Fine with that. It has no evidence, but fine with that. The traditional way to handle these things is to go in, guns blazing, and investigate police departments. Who can be against that? Root out the discrimination. Okay. And so what the second piece, or the third piece of this trilogy is, how do you actually regulate police departments with unknown bias? That's a hard problem. And just demonizing the police, I can say, is not the answer. right? We're going to have to figure out a way to do reform with them, not to them. And that's part of the reason that I think we can start on the lower level uses of force, because again, only 10 ride-alongs or so, but I sense that there's real understanding that there's an issue there and that can be fixed because lives aren't at stake. This is about ego and who's cool in the, there's a lot going on here, okay? But what we did do is we looked at all the, so that after Rodney King, quick history lesson, after Rodney King, the federal government got the power to investigate police departments that had a pattern of practice of discrimination or bias, okay? It's happened 50 or 60 times since then, where the feds come in and they investigate. So if you see something like Laquan McDonald in Chicago, after that video gets released, the feds go to town and they come in and they do a full investigation of the police department. Same thing happened with Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Same thing happened with Michael Brown in Ferguson/St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and you hear, unfortunately, from this current administration that that's the policy. We're going to go investigate these police departments and root out what's going on. All right, so we got all this data, and we know when the investigations happen, and we want to understand whether or not this investigation is the right policy tool to solve this problem, because this problem for me is a huge problem. Okay. This line at 0, this is called an event study. This is when the event happened. This is the month, or in some cases, week or day, that the investigation was announced. Okay? So these are crime rates, these are homicides. These are crime rates before the investigation is announced. Look what happens right after they're announced. This is total crime per 100,000 people, trending downward before the investigation, jumps up afterwards. Now, how does that happen? What we do is we take all these investigations that have happened over time, take the day that they were announced, and stack them all on top of each other so that all of them are at say 0. Okay? And then what we do is we look at homicide rates, in this case, before and after that, to see if there's a jump. If this was just a smooth line through here, you'd say there's no effect of that investigation, right? And so what we capture, I want you to understand this. This is, it's not that I don't think that there's something going on here, that if that particular part of policing was discriminatory, that we shouldn't do something about it. Of course. No one wants to solve these problems more than I do. But I want to do them in a real way. I don't want to pretend that we're solving them and then accidentally hurt the people that we think we're trying to help. And that's where data comes in. And so when we did this analysis, what we find is that every time, right, on average, they launch one of these investigations, 179 more homicides happen over the next 2 years. So, for all the horror that happened around Laquan McDonald, Ferguson, Freddie Gray, and others, we estimate that we lost 900 lives because of how we dealt with that. Those 900 lives are mainly in Black communities. Why did it happen? Because the police pulled back. This is the most disturbing, and I'll get to your question in just a second, I promise I'm gonna stop. This is the most disturbing, but I'm a nerd, so the most beautiful graph I've ever produced in my career. This is monthly contacts from the Chicago Police Department. So a contact is, I see someone at 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, and I go over, I say, hey, David, what are you doing over here by this park? And David says, oh, I'm waiting for a friend. All right, great. I write that down on 3.5 card. That's it, that's a contact. Okay. So I'll give you the simple way to think about it. Here's monthly contact leading up to when the investigation is going to be announced. Now remember, Laquan McDonald's an interesting case because it happened a year before we all knew about it. Right? Once we saw the video, we knew about it, but it happened a year previous. And then this drops down and never really returned. An 89% drop in the amount of civilian police contact in the month before versus the month after in Chicago. Okay? Now, some of you are real data nerds that, oh, that's a month, that's a long way. Fine. Here's daily. Daily contact. They were going down. This black line here is when we all saw the video. So yes, they drop down, but look what happens. They go back up. They weather the political storm of like, oh, there's a YouTube video and it goes back up. Then you announce the investigation. Look what happens. Daily. Boom, there's no lag. The exact same, the next day, contacts go down. They never return. If I showed you the same graph for Baltimore, the contacts would literally go down to 0. Have you ever been to Baltimore? You can't have a day. So the uncomfortable truth here, if you want to call it that, or just what the data tell you, and what I'm worried about is, yes, we need police reform, for sure. But as I said before, if we do it to them, and we end up with something that looks like this, maybe in our neighborhoods we'll be fine, and we'll all say, oh yeah, look, we defunded the law, look, we're doing police reform. But the police actually in the neighborhood, when this happens, lives are lost. Period, the end. And so this is not about, I'll shut up with what I started with. This is not about being controversial. I don't care about that at all. I would like nothing more than to have a few more friends. But I'm unwilling to not show you this because these are my people who are dying. And I've had a couple years to think about it. And I can promise you this, I will die on this hill. There is no greater thing, in my opinion, to do than to sit around and to figure out what the data earnestly say about how we can be helpful to those who started out life with a tougher lot. Right, I'll shut up and ask some questions if we have time.
My question has to do with aspects. This data, along with some information that I work with, that brought to light, has been discussed in discussions that I've seen. How do you respond to someone saying that there are lower performance achievements in Black because of facility, because of their background? How's it square?
Yeah. He wants to know how does education, the gaps that we see, how is that related to differences in wealth, differences in resources like buildings and things like that, right? That's fair? Facilities, right? Facilities do matter. We took all the graffiti off the walls in our places, but we didn't get new facilities. But it is facilities alone don't do anything. You have to it's really simple, the production function. You have to have great teachers and more time to basically produce results. Is it better to have high income parents than not? Yep, sure is. But what we've seen in the work is that only takes care of roughly a third of it, fourth of it, but there's still a huge gap that's left over. And let me get very specific. One of my first papers was about the gap when kids come into school. And so the gap when kids enter kindergarten is completely explained by family wealth, okay? Socioeconomic status, the income, education, occupation of your parents completely explains the gap at school entry. But over time, the gaps widen, even after you control for socioeconomic status. So it's not enough. There's something that's happening to students of color. They're going to inferior schools independent of income, right? And so that is the issue, is that even if we were to, have income that was closer to the same, the school experience is not closer to the same. Now, in places like New York, et cetera, where there are lots of options, and that's slightly different, although I still think it's true. But nationally, that's where I have the data. Nationally, the gaps are rising. And they're rising at a rate of like 0.1, 0.15 standard deviations a year. That's like 2 months of schooling. That's like white kids going to 11 months and Black kids going to 9 months. That's crazy. And that's why once they get to middle school, there's a 1 standard deviation gap. Right? So Ian would have a lot to say about those things, but let me tell you what my data said, and then Ian can chime in. I alluded to this very early that we did this thing on mobility. So it's very simple. We took 1,000 people, they were all born poor, okay? And then we spent 4 hours with them in their homes, asking them all sorts of questions about their childhood, etc. It's not perfect, I'm just telling you the design. And then what we did was say, okay, for the 35% of people who got out of poverty, what's different about them relative to the other people, given this massive amount of data we collected? And as I said before, education is number one. But number two is resilience. In the top 10 are locus of control and those other types of things you described. The difference is I don't know how to produce those just yet. I don't know how to increase resilience at scale. And so those are the types of things that I'm working on right now. I want to know, and I think those are the types of things that great charter leaders do as well. I mean, I have literally heard people I respect in the education reform movement who are like, I'm going to pound resilience into these kids, right? And that's literally what they think. How they do that, I don't know. That's the next way of my next wave of things, because I think these things that you describe are super important, right? And I wanted to tell you about this in Dallas. It's super important, and these are the kinds of things that I want to evaluate teachers on, not just test score gains, but what about resilience gains? As a parent, I'm really interested in that, right? Because my kids' test scores are high, but resilience. Yeah. And the short answer to that is no one's collected that data at a large scale, and that's the issue. We did that for schools. So what you're trying to understand is the production function, and we don't know. The things that are associated are the things I'm describing, which I think are related to what you're describing those most basic levels, but I haven't seen that. Things like number of children's books in the home, that we have a correlation on, highly correlated with test scores early in life. Again, but we need more basic stuff like you described. Yes, all the way to the back. I haven't. I do know of that happening, but I have not looked into that to see. It'd be interesting to know if my guess is it's not going to change their test score results, because I don't think a lot of the folks I know on the ground aren't changing their everyday moves and practices. That was just a slogan that they changed. But it'd be interesting to look into. I think that the question I have on, well, I'll stop there. Yeah.
My question is, have you studied like remote and involved?
Yeah, he is asking about the importance of the involvement of parents. Is there another answer besides having parents involved is good? I mean, like that's. I haven't. It's a really, not that it's not important, it's really hard, right? Like parents aren't involved randomly. And it's really hard to get an experiment by where you say, I want to go break up this family and see the effect. And so it's just, you can use things like tax benefits and cost of marriage. You can do that, but it's really like even quantifying the impact of divorce is really hard. So there've been decades of attempts. This is my undergraduate thesis, was trying to understand the impact of divorce on test scores. I failed then, and many have failed after. But I think it's a really important thing. However, the reason I don't talk about parents much is because practically, I've just heard it used as an excuse too often. There's nothing we can do, the parents aren't involved. Or wouldn't it be better, we could totally do this if the parents were involved. And my own view is the parents are sending you the best kids they got, they're not hiding the good ones at home. And so we have to just take whatever comes across the school. So I like to strip away all excuses, not to change it, right? Like all those kids and things where I showed you those huge results. Some parents were involved, some were not. When they're involved, it makes it a lot easier. A lot easier. But I don't want people to use it as an excuse not to do something. One here, and then we'll go over.
I'm very similar to that.
It's been a kid the last 10 years. It's really the cultural input of education. That really got my boyfriend, he's very able to do that. Back, I have to do all that to these small things, not even it. I'm interested in the culture of why, because it seems like we're studying is hard, harder than is there a way that now when you're home to so that there could be a way around this situation where you get a bailout? Somebody can get a situation.
100%. And in fact, if anyone doesn't, I think that's foolish. I think it's really foolish to act like there aren't real issues there. If we can just all pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, it'll be different, right? Like, so I think there's a delicate balance here, and I can talk about how I do it personally. But whenever I'm in these schools, I like every other principal that I've seen be effective. It's actually not it's not like it's a knife edge. There's a way of acknowledging what you're going through without without encouraging you to make excuses about it, right? And there's a way to say it's just a judgment call. There's a way that some days you just need some time off to do something. There are lots of exceptions here, right? Listening to what kids want to achieve, what they're going through, what the real constraints are. And it's a real skill that amazing principals and leaders in communities have of being able to separate out what a functional constraint to get people back on the right thing and what is like, hey, maybe this isn't it, right? So for example, many times in life I didn't have something to eat. That's a functional thing. Being hungry is a for real thing, right? Like, on the other hand, I had a real weird relationship with white people, frankly. I thought they were all kind of against us all, right? That's how it was described in my neighborhood. I'm not making excuses. And it was helpful for me, for people throughout my journey to separate those two out, right? I literally had someone laugh in my face when I told them I could tell if someone was racist by looking at them. The data guy, I said that when I was in high school, right? Versus like, yo, I could get a ride here because I don't have any right? And so yes, that's a long-winded way because your question touched me, but there's a way of acknowledging for sure, right? Like, man, my father was super violent. I know what it's like to hold a woman's hand at age 10 and watch her get her teeth sewn back in her mouth. And then go to the next day and study for a test. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? On the other hand, I always wanted to get out of that neighborhood. I always wanted something. And I was willing to work really hard at getting out. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. And the way we do it now is just it's swung too far in the opposite direction, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle where we can say, yo, I can acknowledge what you must be going through. This is hard. It's really hard. But you're the person to do it, right? Like, effort is still positive. If you put in effort, better things will happen. Is it a tax? Yes, there's a tax, right? But I tell any young person involved in my life, yes, okay, I estimate that labor market discrimination against black people is 7%. So that's like an extra state tax. You know what happens when people have extra state? Like if I raise the state tax, you know what would happen? People would bitch about it and keep working. That's what you're allowed to do. They don't shut down because it's 5%. Oh, I'm never going to work anymore. But I'll sit here and listen to all the complaining as long as when you get back from work. Like, I'm willing to do all that because I think that's fair. But yes, thank you for the question. I think it's tremendous. We got to acknowledge and keep moving. Yes, ma'am.
How can we get the unions to buy into at least acknowledging your study and get started right away in acknowledging that public schools as it exists today is the right answer?
I think I'd rather solve the Ukraine. I mean, this is really hard. I don't know, man. I don't know.
Can we at least start with the U.S. Department of Education? I know a lot of people are saying get rid of the Department of Education. But at least if we could have a rule that a certain percentage of charter schools in each school district would be permitted without objection from the union. And
yeah, I don't do politics, clearly, right? So I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. What I can say is that I don't think the union and it's a different beast than the one here in New York, but they weren't excited about the work we did in Houston. When we did it in Springfield, Missouri, the union rep announced me to the teacher, and he said, "Roland Fryer is the best of bad options." And I said, "Oh, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it." So I think the charter school thing is hard because they view that as in direct competition. The things I just described to you are things where they can continue to exist in a new system that's different. And so I'm perhaps naive, but I think education police, it's all the same thing of trying to do it with people and not to them. But I don't know. Hard. Yes.
I have a question about the cited. From my experience, the community, they incentivize the other way. They have a support system, they have a government, they have money to come in. It seems to me that you're trying to go the other way.
Yeah.
So that's a huge gap. And how do you get that cultural shift?
Incentivize the right behaviors. This one I know because it's outside of the union, right? So one of the things that I never talk about, and I should more when it comes to the incentive stuff, is it's actually really scalable, right? Like my grandmother got her Social Security check on time. like government's pretty good at payments, right? And so I can imagine that we can really do this at scale. So yes, it's not. So there's part of the disincentive going the way you described. The motivation for the whole research thing was that also there are other factors in society that are pulling our kids in different ways for different types of incentives, right? And I wanted to provide a step-by-step way to kind of go through the gauntlet that we want them to go through and provide interim incentives to go that way. Because the calculation that we're asking kids in these neighborhoods around here to make is crazy. You're saying, go down a path you may or may not have seen anyone go down and wait 14 years for your reward. My kids can't wait till tomorrow for ice cream, right? And they got everything. It's really insanity to think that kids can do this. And so part of the things that parents do, that schools do, and all that is to provide culture and structure to go through the chute that you want them to do and provide incentives to do that. Okay. Now, Ian in this school could hug kids, tell them that's what I'm talking about. That's good enough for a lot of kids. That's hard to scale. And so what we did was provide financial incentives, bank accounts, et cetera, for kids. And I think that's a real way to try to get increases in effort, but it won't close the achievement gap. That's why I try to do something there.
But we give the bank account financial.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how much it worked. I mean, I tell the truth to a fault. You know, one of the kids in our schools here in Crown Heights. This was back in '08 when Crown Heights wasn't cool. And I walked into the school in Crown Heights, PS 399, and the kid said, I said, how was your financial literacy class? He said, oh man, it was good. You want me to manage your money, professor? I was like, tell me how you manage my money. He said, I treat your money the same way I treat my own money. I put it in the bank, let it earn some of that interest. Next week, I take it out and spend it. So I don't know about that, but yes, we did. In all seriousness, we did create bank accounts for every single kid. I know more about the Patriot Act than anyone should. And we, more importantly, we actually did the consumer expenditure survey to our kids, and so we know what they spent their money on. Because a lot of the flack that we got was kids were going to, a fifth grader, but for a little bit of money, it was going to go buy drugs. It turns out, at least they don't report it. Maybe they did, but I don't think so. They actually saved a lot of money relative to the control. I was really excited. Yeah, we'll go back. Yes.
What do they say about I think after the Federal investigation, they had more about a report.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So it may not be your all this extra work you're asking to do. I'm not going to do.
I think it's, I don't know the fraction, but I've heard three explanations. One, this job sucks as it is, and now you're telling me that I'm not a hero, right? Like, you want to do it yourself? Do it yourself. That's explanation A. Explanation B is, yes, not only did they go from a 3x5 car, they went to a 2-pager in Chicago. And so that's why you see this. It goes flat and never recovers, because this is the date we have this day time that the ACLU went to a 2-pager. And so it went from a 3x5 card can fill in 20 seconds to a 2-pager. So they say, you know what? I'm just not gonna stop it back. And the third is, there is a real view, at least there was, that nobody wants to be a YouTube sensation. Right? And so if you don't get in trouble for doing nothing, guess what? Right? Like,
I just think it was so important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those other two factors are real. And, look, outside the scope of this and outside the scope of even, this time, the whole race and police issue, there are really good papers that show when you do final offer arbitration with police departments. Okay. Again, very different context, but same basic idea. Final offer arbitration is the management and labor have to try to have different proposals about what wages, et cetera, work conditions should look like. They can't agree. They go to final offer arbitration, and the arbitrator picks one, not picks each parts of one, picks one of them. And so what you can see is look at police behavior when theirs gets picked versus management. And they call it the blue flu. Whenever they lose in those things, crime goes up. Right? And so this is just a magnified version of what happens when you piss off police officers. It's just that simple. Like, it's just not that complicated. And yeah, you're right. There's 3, maybe 5, maybe 10 explanations for why they're pissed off. But that's essentially what has happened. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay, so two parts. One is for parental involvement. I wonder if you have studied 2-parent household, 1-parent household, 1-parent household, grandparents or divorced parents, but they work with each other. How that affects student achievement. And then I'm really excited about your Houston charter school result. What's the next step for that?
Oh, that's a great question. So for the first, yes, we looked at all those things, and they're all correlated. We just don't know, kind of like before, family structure in terms of a causal estimate on, like, hey, if we were to lower the number of divorced households, what would be the estimated effect on test scores? I don't know. Right? It's a great question. I just don't know the answer. What I do know is that it's a lot easier to do the work I'm doing with 2-parent households, right? Because it's just easier, and there's more stability for students, and so it makes the work easier. But what I'm trying to press upon you today is it doesn't make it impossible, even when that's not true. That's number one. In terms of the education result, oh man, that super frustrating. that was, it may still be the work I was proudest of my entire life, right? Because we went in and like, you know, again, I'll give you the details, but of our 4 high schools, 100% of those kids got accepted to a 2 or 4 year school. Right? Like, don't clap. Turns out if you lock them in the gym and don't let them out until they apply, it all works. Expectations, you know, it's just that simple, right? If people came to me, what about the students who are special ed? Because I said, we're not going to make the choice for them. Okay, what happened with that result? Okay, we had a superintendent's conference. We had them from around the country come in and observe the Houston schools. Okay, my favorite was a gentleman from, he was the state superintendent. I'm not going to name the state because I don't want to call him out, from a Midwestern state. And he used to be a Houston principal, so he knew how bad the schools were before he left. And he took me to the side. And this is the best compliment I've ever gotten, except for maybe the union. He said to me, he says, yo, brother, what you really do with them other kids? And I was like, no, these are the actual. What's the actual kid? He's like, no, I'm serious. I said, I'm serious. Okay, so we had that, and people said they wanted to do it, right? Lots of enthusiasm. You know, Milwaukee's going to do it. Tulsa's going to do it. Everybody's going to do it. And they go back and they say, here, 2 things. They said we're a limit. Number 1, we spent in the secondary schools, we spent $1,863 more per kid. It was to pay for the time and the tutoring. For elementary schools, it was revenue neutral. We kept it. So can't do it. Can't do the cost. Of course, I offered to look through their budget and get rid of all the shit that didn't work, but they didn't take me up on that. $1,863. And the second thing is the unions were really tough, because here we worked so fast from Mother's Day until the fall. We had done all this work in 9 schools. And so I think that was an issue. So I didn't stop there. I said, okay, fine, but I'm not going to let the whatever millions of dollars we raised go down the tube because people don't want to implement this further. So I did 2 things. Number 1, I came here to New York and I took 30 schools and I said, what happens if we just do the tutoring? Right? And forget all the other stuff that's controversial. What if we just do the tutoring? And the answer is you get about 1/3 of the effect or half of the effect if you just do tutoring. And so we showed that here in New York City. And I think that's one of the reasons that one of the big COVID responses now is, let's just do tutoring, right? Because tutoring actually does work. The second thing we did was that I think after having some time to rest, this wore us all out. I had this view that basically what happens will be better managed school, and that management is free. Better management is free. And so could we make our principals better managers, do the data, figure out how to find ways to group kids in schools, like just be more efficient managers? And in fact, if you look across the world, schools that do better on a management index have higher outcomes. Literally, it's up and to the right, it's beautiful. But that's a correlation. We didn't know if there was a causal effect. And so we did another experiment in Houston schools where we took 30 some odd schools and we just worked with the principals to make them better managers. And what we found is that you can get a portion of the effect just by doing that. Now, we've done all this work academically to try to show that this is not magic, that these are basic building blocks of how you run schools, and that more importantly, it's actually scalable. And unfortunately, I think pieces of this have been replicated around the country, but not nearly enough.